Was Shakespeare gay? For years, guys, this question has sent both experts and fans into a tailspin. But as our guest today demonstrates, that question misses the point entirely. In fact, as Will Tosh argues, sex, intimacy, and identity in Elizabethan England were infinitely more complex and more queer than we've ever been taught. Hey, everybody, welcome to Historians of the Movies podcast. I am your host and creator, Jason Herbert, and every single week we are talking about movies and the histories behind them. And this week, we're talking about 1998's Shakespeare in Love. And guys, this pod today offers us the opportunity not just to talk about Shakespeare's works, but about the man himself and the world surrounding him. So I invited on an amazing guest, and I'm talking about Will Tosh. Will is the head of research at Shakespeare's Globe in London, and he's a scholar of early modern literature and culture, and he's also a historical advisor for television and radio, and he is the absolute perfect person to talk to about Shakespeare, sexuality in England, and the world around them. So this is one of the most surprising conversations I've ever had. Will is a brand new friend of mine. I just love the guy to death. I think you guys are too. I am so excited for you guys to hear this pod. So I'm going to keep this intro short. So sit back and relax. Shakespeare in Love is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. So I got this relationship going with Basic some time ago, where I just reached out to them and said, "Hey, if you guys have anything you want me to take a look at or whatever," and they said, "Here, take a look at our catalog." And I'm flipping through on my screen, right, and I see this book, my friend, right here, pop out at me, and I was like, "What is this?" You wrote this book, Straight Acting: The Hidden Queer Lives of William Shakespeare. And Will, I've never read a book on Shakespeare before I read your book.
I think this is a good one to break the surface. Let's just put it that way.
Oh man, do I ever feel that way?
Yeah.
And I have to tell you, and you say this actually in towards the introduction, where it's like, hey, this is a this other scholars have written, but this is a book for everybody. I kind of felt like this was a book that was a really cool introduction to Shakespeare, to get me thinking about Shakespeare.
I'm really glad you said that. So I love reading books. I mean, look, I'm a Shakespeare academic, but I've always loved reading books about Shakespeare that are for a general reader. And I read lots when I wasn't an academic and when I was training to be an academic. I think writers like James Shapiro or Emma Smith or Catherine Duncan Jones, these amazing writers who can bring loads of scholarship to bear on really interesting stories about Shakespeare's life and times. I think it's the greatest skill, because lots of people do love Shakespeare's plays and they're really interested in his life, but some scholarship can be inaccessible, can be hard to literally get your hands on, and then quite hard to kind of follow when you're reading it. So I really wanted to write something that was enjoyable by people who didn't have a huge background in Shakespeare studies, but wanted to find out more about the person.
Yeah, and we'll get into this obviously more during the pod, right? But, I felt like Shakespeare, at least for me in my own growing up, I grew up in a very rural place in Kentucky here in the U.S., and, the introduction to Shakespeare is, it happens in middle school and high school and things like that. And, you read some stuff or things like that. But I always feel like this might be a guy who, at least American audiences, might take for granted, Will, and we can talk a little bit later on about other interpretations of his work. They're all over pop culture. When we were deciding what film to do, we could have chosen a whole bunch more. And I actually want you to come back to do. I want you to come back to do 10 Things I Hate About You. I was reading your book. I'm like, I have to have him come back to do another one of these, because
definitely. That'd be a great.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Right. But I felt like Shakespeare's this guy who it's almost easy to take for granted and make assumptions about, because he's just like, okay, Shakespeare. And then you get to read this book. And it's so cool to think about him in a way. And you talk about this as like, how Shakespeare had, his work, and he and himself had been, ungayed over the centuries.
So there's so much here to talk about. But before we talk about this will, I want to talk about the other will, and that's the will before me. That would be you, Dr. Will Tosh. So you want to introduce yourself to our audience and tell us what you do?
Of course. Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening and watching. I am Will Tosh. I am Director of Education at Shakespeare's Globe in London, which is the wonderful reconstruction of the 1599 Globe, as well as a wonderful model of an indoor theatre called the San Juan Playhouse in a beautiful campus on the banks of the River Thames, where I help to run our higher education and research programs, work with our theatre artists and writers, and write and research about Shakespeare's life and work, and try and kind of spread that message to as many people as want to listen or read and watch.
How did you come into this line of work? Were you always thinking, I want to study Shakespeare, this is my guy? What's your path?
So I had a brief career working in theatre many years ago, and did work on some early modern drama and some Jacobean revenge tragedies. I didn't actually do a huge amount of Shakespeare, but did lots of similar stuff. And then I moved away from theatre and went and did a PhD on the kind of emotional relationships between Tudor spies, late Elizabethan spies who were kind of working on the continent of Europe. And I looked at the relationships between these men and kind of how they talked about their feelings. And that finished that and went to work at the Globe when our indoor theatre opened, and I ran a research project on performance in that indoor theatre. So that's just those two strands kind of came together: my background in theatre and my knowledge of, or my training in kind of late 16th century life and culture, and that in that space is obviously Shakespeare. So I then, in the 10 years I've been at the Globe, have spent a lot of my time thinking about Shakespeare's plays and relearning to love them all in various different ways. But I find all of them fascinating. And the world that he was part of, and the kind of cultural, creative world that he was part of, is, very deeply in me.
Well, before we jump into this film, I want to ask you, the germination of this project itself. You talked about, hey, in the book you say, hey, there are other works. Obviously, people have studied Shakespeare for years and years and years, but you wanted to bring this to a larger audience, to maybe a wider audience, a different kind of audience. I'm wondering, what was the germination? We thought, wait a second, there's a story here to be told, and that you were the person to tell the story.
Well, I mean, we've been very unfair to your listeners and watchers. I don't think we've actually said what this book is about. So this book is called Straight Acting: the hidden queer lives of William Shakespeare. It's called The Many Queer Lives of William Shakespeare in the UK. So if I stutter on that title, forgive me. I'm trying to translate in my head. So this is a study of the queer culture that Shakespeare was part of, and that for me is it's kind of a hidden history, in the sense that there isn't still a kind of huge amount of accessible public history on the backstory of queer desire in times before the 19th or 20th centuries in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere in Europe. Shakespeare, for me, is an artist of queer desire. He writes about same-sex desire exquisitely and beautifully in his plays and his poems, and he's a writer who also lived at a time when culture, broader society, made space for queer desire in ways that we're not very aware of or familiar with. And it wasn't a kind of a queer-friendly culture like some of us live in today. It was very much not the same as the world that I live in London, and lots of your listeners will live in the United States and elsewhere. But nonetheless, it was a culture and a time that acknowledged same-sex desire as something that was part of being human. And there were mixed feelings about it and complex feelings about it. But Shakespeare, as a writer, was able to explore those sorts of emotions and those sorts of desires, which is what he does in his plays and his poetry. So I really wanted to take a lot of that research that has happened. There's been extraordinary work on early modern queer culture in 40 or 50 years of scholarship. And I really wanted to turn some of that scholarship into a story about Shakespeare's life and the kind of life and world that he knew, and wrap that into what we understand Shakespeare's biography to be, which isn't quite the same thing as coming out and making a big song and dance about Shakespeare being queer, although I kind of think he is. But it's to kind of paint that picture of a world which we have as a kind of modern culture, we have really de-gayed. We've really de-queered in the way we think about the past. And that's what I want to do. I want to kind of just tilt that light a little bit and show something a little bit different about a time that some people might think they know quite well.
I love that you did this, because I felt as I'm reading through the book, like I'm getting to being reintroduced to this person who I thought I knew. And I'm certainly not a Shakespeare expert. But there were so many assumptions, Will, that I make about Shakespeare as a straight man. I just go, okay, he writes Romeo and Juliet. He writes this. This is about men and women. And then I start to read your book and I'm like, oh, there's this part here where you're like, wait a second. His best stuff is not about men and women. It's about same-sex couplings.
I mean, look, he writes beautifully about all sorts of relationships, and he writes exquisitely beautifully about straight relationships. But I would also say that I suppose what we think straight relationships aren't the same in 1600. That the way in which the Shakespeare society understood patriarchy, men and women, the kind of the embeddedness of misogyny means that we should kind of like maybe check ourselves a little bit if we're taking Shakespeare's portrayal of straight relationships and heteroerotic desire as our kind of baseline for what love is. And the same goes for queer relationships. I'm not saying we should all follow Shakespeare's example and how to conduct queer relationships, but just they are there and they're particular to their time. And I suppose the film we're going to talk about right now is right there in the center of that sort of that the way in which modern culture co-opts Shakespeare to speak for particularly what straight love is, in a way that we might want to unpick a little bit.
Yeah, I felt like as I was watching this film, I was like, oh man, there's a lot of unpacking that we need to do with this. And you're absolutely right. I just had on the podcast my terrific friend Kit Hayam, who just wrote a terrific book.
I know Kit very well. Yeah.
Oh, you do? Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Love Kit. But did such amazing work demonstrating that like all of this has always been there. And again, another person making this stuff really accessible. Okay, so I have to tell you, this was actually the very first time I had seen Shakespeare in Love.
No way. You hadn't seen it before.
No, okay, so I have to tell you, it's a film that I'd always kind of, and part of the love I have of this podcast and what we've been doing on HATM for the last 6.5 years is it gives me the excuse and sometimes forces me to go and see these films that I otherwise would be like, I'll get around to it, right? And of course, you're familiar with Shakespeare in Love. This film comes out. It wins in 98 for Best Picture, kind of famously defeating Saving Private Ryan. There's still people still talk about this film. But I'd never seen it. So I sat down and watched it with your book in hand, taking notes copiously. I was like, okay, what am I seeing here? And I felt that was kind of good in this regard because it's like everything to me was super fresh, being able to like read your book and then watch this. So I have so many questions about William Shakespeare based on like rumors, stories I've been told, the little I know. This is, well, I feel like I want to come to you as a complete ignorant person and ask you all of these questions tonight. So let's do this. Let's start by seeing the very first time we see Shakespeare. It's in the shape of Joseph Fiennes, this very lithe, obviously very handsome guy. And I'm wondering, who is William Shakespeare in 1593? Like when we first get to know him, like, can you give us a little background about who this man actually was up until, say, this point?
I will say that Joseph Fiennes' inky fingers are possibly the best thing about this film. I mean, there are many good things about this film. I actually really like. I really love Shakespeare in Love, but that sort of the sort of grubby, inky sort of grime over his hands is fabulous. I loved it. So this film is so interesting in what it does with history and biography, and we first see Shakespeare, don't we? Like we're introduced to the theatre, and then we get this wonderful kind of view of him in his lodgings. He's in his apartment, He's in his loft. He's got this very roomy, sort of rather stylish looking kind of like bachelor pad. Very beautiful Joseph Fiennes with his lovely eyes and his beautiful hair. And it's 1593. We're told that in the title cards, aren't we, at the start of the film?
Sure.
And Shakespeare is a sort of, struggling writer. It's such a weird time to start a film about Shakespeare's career in the theatre, because in 1593 the theatres are closed because of a terrible plague outbreak. So that nothing is happening in 1593. There's no theatre at all in London, and Shakespeare probably isn't in town. So that's the sort of first thing that we note watching the start of Shakespeare. The other is actually 1593 is a really major year for Shakespeare, like a really big year, because it's the first time that anything he writes gets published. None of his plays are published in 1593. His first plays get published in 1594, not with his name on the title. But in 1593, he does publish something. He publishes his long poem, Venus and Adonis, which is not a play, it's not a drama, it's a kind of extension of this little story in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is this collection of Greek and Roman myths. And it's about Venus, the goddess of love, who is massively hot for this incredibly beautiful young hunter. Adonis comes onto him super intensely, and Adonis is very much like, I don't want anything to do with you, goes off on a boar hunt and gets killed, and Venus is very sad. So Shakespeare takes this quite short little story in Ovid's Metamorphoses, expands it tenfold into a 1,000-line long poem, and he's writing it because he hasn't got any theatre work, because the theatres are all closed.
Mm-hmm.
Publishes it in 1593, and it goes stratospherically popular. So by the end of 1593, Shakespeare is super famous as a master of love, but it's through Venus and Adonis, lyric poetry, kind of sexy, violent, kind of slightly queer-coded, let's be honest, poetry that gets read by men and women. Young people get super sort of excited by it as, very lightly pornographic literature. So 1593 is a key year for Shakespeare, but not the way we see it in Shakespeare in Love.
How old would he have been? He's mid-20s, upper 20s at this point in time?
29 in 1593. Sorry, can I just do that math in my head? Hang on. 1564. Yeah, that's 29, isn't it?
Sounds right. Right.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Good.
Well, I'm a historian. Like, numbers don't even mean anything to me.
What are numbers? Yeah.
Does it matter?
Yeah.
I'll just use Chat GPT. Like all of my all my professor friends, students are just like, hey, I'll do this.
We need to model better practice. No. Yeah.
I know it. I have to ask you a question.
Yeah.
One of the things in my limited understanding of Shakespeare up until now, has been the question of, A, who is this guy? And B, is he really the one doing all of these works? I've always heard these rumors, like there's actually many people using this name or writing this stuff. Can we put this to bed?
We can put this to bed. I mean, what I will say is that certainly in Shakespeare in Love, we see him really as a solitary genius, don't we? He's there writing away in his apartment. Yeah. And particularly when things strike him, he kind of goes off and he has these experiences and then runs home to kind of write the rest of Romeo and Juliet. That's a very kind of, quite a modern idea of how literary genius works. Now, Shakespeare was a literary genius, but he did work in a collective. He worked with theatre companies. He co-wrote with other playwrights. Mm-hmm. He worked on other people's plays and, gussied them up and refurbished them. And other people did that to his work in later years as well. And, he would get inspiration from other people, but Shakespeare wrote his plays. And there's absolutely no ambiguity around what people in Shakespeare's own time thought he did, which is write his plays and poems. So those plays that we associate with him are his, and they're published as his poems, some of them in his own lifetime, and then the vast majority of them in a big old compilation in 1623 called the First Folio, which is called Master William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, Tragedies, and it's got a massive great picture of him on the front cover, and lots of people write poems saying he's great. Shakespeare, who wrote these plays, is great. So there's no ambiguity around his authorship. But there is a kind of more complex story about how playwrights wrote plays, which is as a slightly more collective and collaborative activity than the notion of a kind of genius poet, the kind of post-romantic notion of a genius poet that we might have today.
I find I find this I was trying to think about who a contemporary might be that I could compare Shakespeare to, and I'm going to throw a name at you, and I swear to God, I am not doing this for shock value, but for whatever reason, I keep thinking of Taylor Swift, of all people,
right?
And who shoots to the stratospheric fame, but is a worker. She works.
Yeah.
And I thought a lot as you were just telling me about the ways in which Shakespeare writes his plays, and his contemporaries write their plays.
Yeah.
This is a job. This is you go to create a thing, and sometimes do it in concert with others, right?
Right. And Taylor Swift that's not a crazy comparison. I mean, there are all sorts of online memes asking you to guess whether it's Taylor Swift or Shakespeare that writes a certain line. Like sort of it. Yeah. And in a sense, any literary artist who is channeling culture's thoughts and ideas. I mean, totally. And I would not be surprised if people are still talking about Taylor Swift in 50 or 100 years, because she's a cultural force, of course. I mean, and in future years, we'll be reading things into Taylor Swift lyrics that maybe Taylor didn't expect to be there. And I'm sure the same thing can be said about Shakespeare. But he absolutely right. Shakespeare was he was a working writer. And one of the things actually that Shakespeare in Love again gets right is that kind of interrelationship of writing as a business and managing a theatre as a business and producing theatre as a. But yeah, there's a point where Henslowe offers Shakespeare a share in the company. That's not true quite the way the film presents it, but that's what Shakespeare does. The year after Shakespeare in Love is set in 1594. Shakespeare does buy into the Lord Chamberlain's men, becomes a shareholder, co-owner of the company, and draws an income as a business owner, as well as an income as a playwright, as well as an income as an actor. So he's very canny when it comes to how it's a horrible phrase, but like how he's monetizing his writing and his craft. And he's very lucky to live at a time when it's possible for the equivalent of a middle class person coming from the provinces with a really good school education, but didn't go to university, really good school education, to make a living through writing, through creative writing, literary writing, which hadn't really been possible even a generation before. Shakespeare's it's a startup industry, playwriting at this point. It's still comparatively new to be a commercial playwright and make a living out of your writing.
So many of his plays and his works feature rivalries, and I'm wondering, did he himself have rivals in this era? Were there other folks out there?
Yeah. The first thing in print we hear about Shakespeare is the words of a rival. So there's a writer, pamphleteer, playwright called Robert Greene, who writes a sort of rather sour kind of satire called Greene's Groatsworth of Wit in 1592. And it may also have been finished by someone else. Like, it's probably Robert Greene. We say it's by Greene, but, it could have been. It's complex. But in Greene's Groatsworth of Wit, it's a sort of slightly weird text about, it's a kind of loosely fictionalized idea about a kind of wild living person and his repentance at the end of his life. And along the way, there is a reference to an individual who is 99.99% certain to be Shakespeare, who is kind of presented as this figure who is a bit of an upstart, who he's called an upstart crow, who comes along and tries to sort of like muscle his way into the writing space and kind of elbow out the kind of smarter, more university educated writers And also he's an actor, and that's a bit sort of, kind of low class. No one really likes it. And we know it's supposed to be Shakespeare because he's referred to as a shake scene. And one of his lines from the Henry VI plays is kind of misquoted as a way to kind of needle him. So from that very first citation in print, he's in a kind of space of competition and envy and sort of kind of literary aggression, and it's not this is not a wholly harmonious world. Writers were kind of aiming for a kind of slice of the pie, and not everyone was equally successful. So there was definitely competition and definitely rivalry, even if playwrights also wrote together, worked together, shared writing duties on plays. It was a sort of it was a contested space, let's say.
I want to ask you about the casting in this film, because I'm watching this. I'm like, okay, who's real? Who's not? This is obviously not a biopic. It's not a documentary. Sometimes, I think sometimes when we get into these historically based films, there's a knock. I was like, oh, this film is not. It's not real. Now, listen, I just did a podcast on Gladiator 2, and it was awful. Ridley Scott's doing me a favor between making Napoleon and making the Gladiator 2, because these were films that made me pull my hair out.
This makes your job easy.
I love Ridley Scott. Oh my gosh. The man made so many films of my childhood. And yet, at the same time, but it seems, so you take a film like this though, which it's not pretending to be the retelling of William Shakespeare's life.
No, it's obviously.
I felt like maybe the parallel to this might be A Knight's Tale, which is kind of using
kind
history to kind of play.
Yeah. Look, I think what's really interesting about this film is I think it's fairly upfront about its fictional elements.
Yeah.
And it does that, I think, by it signals things with names. So I think it's interesting that the heroine, Gwyneth Paltrow's role, is called Viola de Lesseps. So Viola, obviously, we know as a character name from Twelfth Night, and at the end of the film, that's echoed in how Viola and Will ultimately part. De Lesseps is an interesting choice. It's quite not everyone who watches this film will clock it, but de Lesseps is a French aristocratic name, and it's the name of the person who built the Suez Canal in the 19th century. So it's quite a famous name, but not famous for the time that we're talking about in Shakespeare in Love. And similarly with the Earl of Wessex, who is the villainous competitor love interest for Viola. At the time the film was made, that title did not exist. Wessex as a concept kind of didn't really exist. It was an old Anglo-Saxon kingship, and then it was a sort of made up county in the novels of Thomas Hardy. It was sort of nowhere. It was sort of Narnia. And Wessex does exist now. It was then made as an aristocratic creation for the then Queen's youngest son, Prince Edward. So the film is sort of saying Wessex and Viola de Lesseps, they're not real, they're made up. But then actually lots of the other people in the film really are. So the film is quite good. The film is quite good, actually. I mean, it's not exactly right, but it's quite good at giving sort of people more or less the right identities for more or less the job that they do. So Geoffrey Rush playing Philip Henslow. Yes, Philip Henslow. Yes, ran the Rose, was evidently a businessman. Don't think he was quite as unsuccessful as the film makes him out. Burbage at the theatre. Yes, absolutely. Tilney, who's the master of the revels. Yes, that was a real person. Obviously, Queen Elizabeth I was very much a real person in an extraordinary performance by Judi Dench. Actually, a lot of those characters are historical and kind of had the life that the film presents.
Now, and I have to tell you, as I'm watching this film, it's my first time watching, and I hadn't actually done a lot of prep work. Usually, I'll do a lot of work on the film. So, or I'll be more familiar with the film. I've usually seen the movie that we're doing on the pod, and I'll know who's in the movie. In this case, I knew really Joseph Fiennes, and I knew Gwyneth Paltrow because that's the story, right? And the first thing we see Jeffrey Rush, and then I'm looking at Tom Wilkinson, and I'm like, okay, who else is in this film? And it turns out everyone
British actor of 1997 is in this film. Yes.
And Ben Affleck.
Yes. Extraordinary. Yeah, playing Edward Allen. Yeah,
a little bit.
Yeah.
And after you talked about Wessex, and I'm looking at Colin Firth going, wait a second, I'm supposed to like you in movies. This feels weird.
It's a fun stretch for him, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, he does it brilliantly.
He's good.
He's very good.
I think he's one of those guys where and he's done this really cool thing over his career, where he's starting to play the different roles, and it's almost Michael Caine-ish in his career trajectory, where he's aged. He's starting to see him start to take on now the more mentor-esque kind of roles and things like that. He's so much fun. But to put all of these people kind of in place here, can we talk a little bit about the Rose Theatre?
Yeah.
And talk a little bit about how these London playhouses, I know in 1593, they're not operating.
They're not open.
But
other than that,
when they do, aside from that small aspect of the fact that they're not actually doing their job.
Yes, apart from that small thing. So the film is sort of, again, like a lot of things in this film, the film is good in principle at kind of getting the various sort of factors at play here, and then quite rightly, because it's a film and not history, just goes, no, that doesn't work. Let's do something else. So yeah, these theatres are not open. The theatre companies that are talked about as well, the Lord Chamberlain's men, the Lord Admiral's men, they don't exist yet. They don't come into existence until 1594. So they're not around at 1593. But that notion that the two of them are these sort of competitor companies, I think it's broadly right for the later years, but after 1594. There are other companies at play in the earlier years as well, who were sort of merging and breaking up, and personnel are kind of moving around between these companies. And you sort of get a feel for that in the film, I think, particularly that sense that the companies are competition and they kind of like are angry at each other. But then by the end, when the whole sort of edifice of theatre has been threatened, they really come together and they sort of, share their assets and their actors, and they put on a and that sort of stuff does happen. The companies merge and go on tour and do things together. One thing we don't see, which is interesting at all in the theatre landscape, is a form of theatre that by 1593 had only recently taken a pause, and that was indoor theatres, small, rather beautiful, elite little indoor theatres lit by candlelight, where all of the performers were adolescent boys. So that was a really major part of theatre culture through the 1580s. So the sort of run-up to Shakespeare in Love, really major and much more focused around sort of well-to-do or elite or aristocratic audience members. So there's that really interesting bit in the start of the film where Viola de Lesseps has been watching Shakespeare's Two Gentlemen of Verona at court with the Queen and all the courtiers sitting around watching this play, and everyone else seems unbelievably bored by it, but Viola is kind of totally into this film, this play. She's totally into the play. She adores it. And then goes home and complains to her nurse that she's not allowed to go to the public playhouse. She has to go to court to watch the plays because she can't go to the theatre. And that's not really true. Like you get aristocratic women going to the theatre quite a lot. And particularly so in those earlier years to these indoor theatres at Blackfriars and St. Paul's, which were particularly sort of patronised by aristocrats and by elite figures, and women included. So there's a sort of sense that the film is sort of saying theatre is not for the real poshos, or rather public theatre isn't for the posh people. The posh people go and see theatre at court, which is only half true. Actually, you get a bit of a real kind of range of people attending the public playhouse, and someone like Viola could have easily have gone to the public playhouse.
I want to ask you actually about, we're talking about in the theater, but what about on the stage itself? I mean, what's the sexual dichotomy here of performers and social rules as far as male performers, females? Like, what's going on here?
it's interesting. So again, in that same scene where Viola is complaining to Imelda Staunton, her nurse, that she can't go to the theatre, she also rails against the fact that the law says she can't act as a woman. And it is true. Women do not appear on the commercial stage as actors. But there's no law. There's no law that says they can't do it. And women do act. Women act in court. Women perform as singers and musicians and tumblers, gymnasts, things like that, jugglers. Later in the era, French women, French actors to London and appear on stage. There's an astonishing moment when a kind of real life kind of London play called The Roaring Girl features a character called Moll Frith, who was played in the play by an actor. But at the end of the play, the real Moll Frith got up on stage and played a lute and sang a song. So there are these moments in the era when you see female performance, and women are really involved in the theatre industry as managers, as business people, like people like Geoffrey Rush's Henslow. That sort of figure was frequently a woman. There were women involved as business managers, and there were women involved as sort of box office managers, as gatherers of money at the door, as laundresses, as tailors and dressmakers. So there's a lot of it's not just a male world, but it is a male acting company world. And so you have some companies of boys, as I've talked about in the indoor playhouses, but those big adult companies, the commercial companies at theatres like the Rose and the Theatre, have effectively apprentices. So they have boys probably from about the age of 13 or 14 up to their early 20s playing the female roles. And we see that quite well in Shakespeare in Love, actually, with the character of Sam, who's the boy actor, who's from the very first moment we meet him, we're sort of being led to expect that he's aging out of his casting because his voice is beginning to break, and yeah, that's kind of the case. There's a sense that sort of boy actors are have a kind of a certain lifespan as performers of female roles, but then would potentially age into other casting as they got a bit older. And you see that happening with individual actors through the era, that they start as boy actors, do really well in particular roles, and then go and get cast as adult men a bit later on.
Yeah, so there's the whole child actor syndrome as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure,
yeah.
Right? What do you do? It's funny because I just read Josh Brolin's memoir.
Oh, interesting. Well, indeed. Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he's fascinating story. Really chaotic home life, as a lot of these child actors sadly kind of turns out to be. But he talks about it. After he does the Goonies, there's just this incredible, because he's everywhere now, and we think he's always been successful. But there's this huge time period where he just goes to become a day trader for a while. He's got like a regular job because he can't find his place in Hollywood.
Yeah, and it's by no means certain for a boy actor in this era that they would go on to perform.
I want to step away from the film and actually dive into your book a little bit. And I want to ask you, obviously, the big question, the question you kind of very playfully put out as right towards the beginning, which is Shakespeare. Was he or wasn't he? You want to jump in and just kind of go from there?
Well, I sort of do, really, and maybe we'll come back to the film when we're talking about this, just because it's such a great example of how anxious and edgy everyone gets when thinking about Shakespeare and queer sexuality. But yeah, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because as you've cited already this kind of ongoing question that isn't really a question about Shakespeare's authorship of his plays, and I think there's kind of an ongoing question that isn't really a question about Shakespeare's sexuality and sexual identity as well. It's sort of like, was he gay? Was he not? I don't know. And I'm both fascinated by that question and also slightly frustrated by it, because it seems like a really open-ended question, but actually it's quite a closed-off one. And it's a question that invites a yes or a no, and then sort of like no further comment. And I think, I said earlier, I think Shakespeare's a queer artist, and that for me is a really kind of expansive point to start off at, and to say that, well, I don't know what he desired or what he did. I know he was married. I know he had 3 children. I know that he
would have been the very first queer person to ever be married.
Exactly. That
and have children. The only one ever.
And I have no idea. I have no idea if he had a male partner or if he had a male lover. But what I do know is that he is artistically and intellectually really interested. I would go so far as to say obsessed with the dynamics of same-sex desire, and whether that's expressed in really heightened terms of same-sex male friendship, which is not separable from erotics. I don't think, it's whether or not these friends are sleeping together. These are eroticized friendships. The language is heavily kind of infused with really kind of bodily yearning. So he's fascinated by that. He's fascinated by the seeming conflict between straight marriage or heteroerotic marriage and male friendship, and the apparent clash. As in, like, where does the guy place his heart, like with his friend, or with his wife? And he is also passionately interested in the articulation of desire between men. He writes 126 sonnets exploring a speaker's sort of tormented desire for a beautiful youth. Now, you could say that doesn't mean anything. Maybe it doesn't, but I don't know that many straight men who write 126 poems about their desire for a beautiful youth. Like, I think it means something. Don't know what it means. And fundamentally, I don't massively care, but I am really interested in the queer art that he produces. And I feel like that queer art has a resonance in a queer self somewhere. But hey, he lived 400 years ago, so we're gonna struggle to unpick it. But I think that sort of that queer sensibility is like a really major part of his writing. And because we've been so hung up on saying, well, we've got to prove that he's gay before we have that conversation, we haven't really addressed it. So I'm happy to kind of shove the was he or wasn't he question away and think about the queer art. And look, once we've talked about the queer art for 10 minutes, I think we'll all kind of agree that he was probably a bit queer.
Yeah, I felt like this is a really cool way to think about this by kind of going, well, let's set the question aside and just look at the answers here. And then it's like, it almost felt, Will, like, not to spoil the book, but it's like, obviously.
Well, right? Yeah.
It feels that way.
But I think that's sort of the best compliment. I think if people come away from the book and go, well, why did you even need to write that? Of course you would. Like, brilliant. I'm thrilled by that.
But this was also a thing where I came to it and I had no assumptions about the queerness of Shakespeare to begin with. I'm just like, of course, before I thought deeply about this, going, well, he's responsible for the great loves of our life, right? Mm-hmm. One of my favorite songs in the history of the world is actually Romeo and Juliet, but it's not by Shakespeare. It's by Mark Knopfler and Dire Straits, who write this beautiful take on this. My point being that the man has influenced our conceptions of heterosexual love for years and years and years and years, right? Yeah. But I think that's because of, as you refer to it, this process of ungaying Shakespeare, that we don't complicate our understandings of love, of relationships, of not even, and like you were saying here, like, because I'm thinking about, bromances and things like that, right? And these relationships between, men, women, whomever, right? That are very loving relations, not sexualized, but loving, deep, intimate relationships as well. That I think I wonder if by rethinking Shakespeare's words and works, we start to color our understandings of these relationships differently.
Yes, I think is the answer. And I think it's really interesting that 10 or 20 years ago, whenever that word romance kind of emerged, we kind of had to coin a cute little portmanteau word to explain something.
Because it's safe.
Because it's safe, but also it was marked as unusual. It was marked as though this is this needs a new word because we haven't seen this before. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm sure most cultures through history have had ways to articulate intense same-sex relationships, and sometimes those are eroticized, sometimes not. Sometimes they kind of are, but they're not acknowledged, and it's so complex. They're not, and those two things aren't separate. There may be sort of points on a line, but friendship and relationship are not wholly separate categories, and I suppose in lots of ways never have been. And that's very much what we see in Shakespeare's time. I think to bring it briefly back to Shakespeare in Love, I think what's really interesting about I said it's really interesting so many times, it's so boring. And to bring it back to Shakespeare in Love, we see the film really working hard to fix Romeo and Juliet as the main script of love, of grown-up romantic heterosexual love. And the bits of the play that are maybe suggesting that the love between Romeo and Juliet is a bit insane and teenage get put aside and not really focused on or thought about. And bits of other Shakespeare plays and works that are also dealing in the sort of tropes and stereotypes of love, much like Romeo and Juliet are held up as sort of stale and a bit kind of stagey and fake. So the film starts with Two Gentlemen of Verona, which is indeed an early play. It's written before Romeo and Juliet. But the bits of Two Gentlemen of Verona that we see the audience watching at court are very kind of cardboard and wooden and the lovelorn men kind of, wittering on about their love in ways that we're not supposed to see as particularly compelling or interesting. Compared with Romeo and Juliet, which the film suggests is written in the inspiration of Will's adoration of Viola and their amazing relationship together. It kind of all comes to him in a great big rush, and he kind of writes this astonishing sort of realist and naturalist portrayal of love. And he's sort of spurred on by the Queen saying, in that wonderful scene where Will's there in disguise, I'll set a wager of £50 that a playwright, I can't remember whether she says can or can't now, but a playwright can present the very truth and picture of love. So we're told so clearly by this film that Romeo and Juliet is the invention of an artistic representation of true adult, mature sexual desire. And I think that's sort of rubbish. It's not true. The play isn't doing that at all. But what it's doing is doing what lots of plays and other literary fictions at the time are doing, which is dramatizing love and sexuality and desire in all sorts of really exciting and interesting ways. But it's not taking a whole new kind of approach to it. And the film can only do that by denigrating the other stuff that is happening at the same time, like Two Gentlemen of Verona, and sort of ignoring what the play is actually about. And in other ways as well, I think, because the film is dabbling in storylines around mistaken identity and women dressing as boys, which is obviously a highly Shakespearean trope, it's just kind of reaching a foot into a bit of a queer space, and then immediately drawing back and going, oh no, it's 1997 and it's Merrimax and we're not ready for this.
That. Right.
We are not going there. So, and it just dallies with it, with the idea that Joseph finds as Will is sort of weirdly turned on by Viola's, by the person he thinks is Thomas Kent, who is the boy Viola dresses as. It's so you can there's just moments where you can see the film is allowing you to think that Joseph finds is a little bit confused before they pull back, and that's an interesting caution. I think I suspect if that story was made in 2024, the filmmakers would feel free to have much more fun in delving into the kind of queer energies that would produce. And it shows its age, I think, when you watch it now, that the film is so cautious about suggesting anything other than kind of straight down the line heterosexuality in terms of Will and Viola's relationship.
No, and in fact, the thing that I kept thinking about was, wow, they are really adamant about showing Will and Violet in bed a lot in this film.
Yeah.
Right. This is an overtly. I didn't think I'd see Gwyneth Paltrow nude in this film. Listen, I grew up in the '80s, where we come up with this idea of all of this. The nudity was everywhere in the films, and then there was a purposeful dial back of this. Paltrow, it's almost like they're saying, "Look how it feels." Maybe I'm thinking about this too seriously. Will, it's like, look how straight Will is because there's so much sex with Gwyneth Paltrow.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I think that's right, and it's also it's sex scenes intercut with rehearsal of Romeo and Juliet, and that's the absolute kind of heart of the film. It's the sort of just before the kind of Act 4 turn, isn't it? The heart of the film is the theatre company are thriving. They're rehearsing Romeo and Juliet. Will's having loads of like really fabulous sex with Viola. He's being amazingly inspired. He's writing this play. She's getting really into it. It's all, and it's sort of, I'm not going to use the term problematic because it's not. It's a film. It's like, but it is overt about its own sexual politics in a way that you notice. Yeah. I would also say, as a historian, it's way off when it comes to how plays were rehearsed or produced in 1593. They didn't have great big, group rehearsals for weeks before the play went on. They didn't stand around on the stage going over scenes and mouthing lines to each other. And they certainly didn't kind of spend lots of time practicing kissing on stage like Will and Viola do when she's dressed as Thomas Kent. Like, it just doesn't happen. They don't. That you learn your part privately by yourself in your room until you're word perfect, and then you come and match it all up with everyone else's parts. That's all you do. So, but the film really needs all that rehearsal to get lots of Romeo and Juliet onto the screen in order to intercut it with lots of shagging to show how real the play is about sexual love. So there's quite a lot of crowbarring, I would say. It's laid on with a trowel, I think, to use another Shakespearean expression.
It's odd because this film is 25, 26 years old at this point in time, and
7.
Yeah, I'm feeling older now. Yeah. Will, like every time I have to sit and look at the podcast and see my beard get grayer, and we have a Trump presidency coming again. I'm feeling that by February this is going to be white as snow, my friend.
We're all going to go grey. We're all going to go grey. Well, I remember seeing this film in the cinema. It was made a very big impression on me when I was a 16-year-old.
Oh yeah. I want to ask you: are there parts of this film? Because I don't want to sit like. Obviously some problematic stuff or some things that I think that maybe not even problematic so much as like this is kind of a hallmark of its era. So as historians, we go, oh, this is really neat. Or what they're doing here and the decisions that are being made. But are there parts of this film that you really go, hey, I like what they're doing here. This is kind of speaking to me as a person or as a scholar. Are there other parts of this that really you dig?
Yeah, I actually really like this film. I've always loved it. And I loved it 7 years ago. And I've seen it several times since, and I loved rewatching it for this podcast. I think it's an incredibly witty, incredibly literate film. I think for a major studio release and a major kind of Hollywood film, for all that it features loads of British actors, it is pretty uncompromising actually in terms of the interest it takes in theatre making. For all that they present it wrongly, doesn't really matter. It's interested in theatre, and modern theatre as much as Elizabethan theatre. It's got a kind of real passion for writing and literary history. There's a lovely detail in the film about a young boy who's a part of the theatre company, who's this sort of hopeless, sort of dirty-looking young kid who gets kicked off the cast because he's sort of wrong to play the female lead, and he goes off in a huff, and in the end, actually dobs the theatre company into the Master of the Revels, Tilney. And in one exchange, this boy is asked by Will kind of what he likes about theatre, and he sort of says in this grumpy way, "Oh, he likes the blood, he likes the violence, he likes it." And then Will asks what his name is, and he says he's called John Webster. And John Webster is this fabulous Jacobean playwright of the next generation, who does indeed write really kind of like dark and violent plays. And it's just so lovely that and it's the play, Stoppard, who does the script for, or at least one of the versions of the script for Shakespeare in Love. I suspect that's a Stoppardian insert. That's a lovely thing to do. That's a lovely thing to put into a major Hollywood film. A little reference to, effectively a really obscure Jacobean playwright, even though for those of us who work on early modern drama, Webster is not obscure at all. But for your average Hollywood audience, that's a really obscure reference. And I think it's fabulous that it's in there. That it's a film that really shows respect for and interest in early modern drama, early modern literature, the Shakespeare world, the ways in which you can tell stories about Shakespeare. I think what they do with Christopher Marlowe is fabulous. It's a lovely, it's a great little cameo, and they set up a story that Will might be responsible for Marlowe's death, and there's a great way that they kind of seed that through the film, and then in a really kind of, I think, mature and rather admirable way, the film pulls back at the point of Marlowe's death to say, no, it's not Will's fault. He didn't die through your actions. It was just a terrible brawl in a bar. And that, I think that's brilliant, partly because it shows the film isn't sort of pandering to conspiracy theory, because there's conspiracy theory about Marlowe's death as well. It's quite a kind of grown up response, which I really admire. So there's sort of maturity actually of this film I really like, and I'm really grateful for all that they're getting, other stuff.
I can't help now but think about another podcast by Joe Rogan, who would have loved the conspiracy theories around Marlowe's death, but this is not that pod.
You will get no conspiracy theories from me. None.
Oh, that's perfect and lovely then. Perfect. I want to ask you this, because we're talking about Shakespeare. We're talking about him on stage, and we've moved forward now, 400 years. What about Shakespeare on screen? There is this tremendous body corpus of work, continuing things, either direct adaptations of or influenced by Shakespeare. Are there things out there, Will, that you like? You're like, hey, if you dig Shakespeare, or you want to know some Shakespeare?
Look, Shakespeare's been feeding motion pictures since the late 19th century. Like, it's unending. There is a huge amount out there. And I've already said that I like Shakespeare in Love as a film, and I really do. And I think in terms of films that relay Shakespeare's world, I think it's really one of the best. And one of the sort of wittiest and most learned, even though it takes selective decisions about what to include and whatnot. In terms of filmic productions of or adaptations of Shakespeare's plays, real classics, I think, still bear up incredibly well. Akira Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, amazing Japanese director from 1957. His version of Macbeth, extraordinary filmic work. And in many ways, a really wonderful adaptation of the play, a really good take on the play. Would strongly recommend that. I've got a sort of massive soft spot for the slightly over the top early 1990s Much Ado About Nothing by Kenneth Branagh. That again came out when I was a child, and it's if you think that Shakespeare in Love contains every working British actor in 1997, Much Ado About Nothing does as well, and it's them on holiday in Tuscany. So it's like it's just a great sort of.
Is that the one with Denzel?
Denzel Washington's in it. Yeah.
Oh, that's the one where you see the memes. Well, I haven't seen this one, but you see the memes saying, "Is this the sexiest cast in film history?"
I think it might well be. Yeah. And they're all having a marvelous time. It just looks super fun. Yeah. So I recommend that. And there are some wonderful sort of, there are some wonderful film Shakespeare. So it's not hard to find a good one.
See, this is how I was getting you to volunteer yourself for more pods. Well, because I'm going to beg you to come back. What about other works? People like you and me who like to read, crazy as it is. What are the other books that have inspired your own work, or that you found to be riveting yourself?
So, I mean, I mentioned a couple of people at the start of our conversation, but it's wonderful Shakespearean and writer called James Shapiro, who I hugely admire, wrote a really extraordinary book about Shakespeare's life called 1599, which is a sort of year in Shakespeare's life, a really crucial year in his artistic evolution. It's the year he writes Julius Caesar and Henry V and As You Like It, and it's the year that the Globe Theatre opens. So it's an astonishing year to focus on. And James Shapiro is the most wonderful storyteller and writer. So go away and buy and read 1599. The wonderful British Shakespearean Emma Smith has written extraordinary books on Shakespeare's plays, on Shakespeare's books, particularly on the First Folio. But I would strongly recommend her This is Shakespeare, which is a wonderful series of fairly short kind of essays on the plays. And a wonderful former colleague of mine at the Globe has written an extraordinary book on the history of race and race making and racism in and around Shakespeare, called The Great White Bard: How to Love Shakespeare While Talking About Race. And that came out last year. It's a phenomenal book. So that's by Farrah Coen Cooper. Go away and read that one. It will change the way you think about Shakespeare.
I'm going to have to reach out about this book.
You will have to read it.
Well, our big question at the end of the day, at the end of the pod, is Shakespeare in Love a history movie?
No, it's historical fiction. It's historical fiction, and that's fine. I love historical fiction, but it's not. I don't think it's a history movie.
I feel like, I got to tell you, watching the film, I was kind of convoluted, frankly, on like what I was seeing in a lot of ways, because I didn't have the understanding, really, in a lot of ways, the background, obviously, that yourself has in Shakespeare. And then talking to you about this film makes me, even though I just watched it a couple of days ago, want to go back.
Watch it again.
I absolutely want to, because now I know what to look for and know how to see these kinds of films. And I think in a lot of ways, in addition to getting to know other people, it's the joy of this. It's the joy of discovery, of rediscovery in a lot of ways. And I have to thank you for that, Will, because this has been just the best discussion. I'm sat here the whole time going, this is so fun. This is so great to sit and talk to you about your work, which I find amazing. And interesting. Should we say interesting? That's not interesting.
Let's say interesting again. Well, come on.
Are you kidding me? It is absolutely wonderful. I'm so glad you came on. Well, thank you so very much for being here.
Jason, thank you so much. I had a great time. I really enjoyed it.
And that's a wrap here at Historians at the Movies podcast. Thank you so very much to our guest, Will Tosh, for coming in today. Will, you are amazing. Dude, this was such an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. Fletch, you're the awesomest, dude. Thank you so much. And, of course, thank you most of all to you guys, to the fans, to the people who continue to listen, who continue to share this podcast, our new listeners as well. If you want to support us, the best way you can do is not pledge your money. You can pledge your money, but the best thing you can do is actually share this with a friend. You can put this on social media, and you can tell me what movies you want to hear next on HATM. So thanks so much for being here. We've got a bunch of pods coming your way, and we'll catch you next time. Ciao for now.